They say power always demands a price. Some pay with their conscience, others with their blood, and some pay with very specific parts of the body. And if you think life at an imperial court was glamorous, full of silk, perfume, and intrigues worthy of a luxurious drama, it is because you never stopped to consider what happened to those who served in the most coveted and most dangerous place in the palace, the Imperial Harem. And among all the characters in this theater of excess, none stands out more than the eunuch, this mutilated guardian, the perfect symbol of how power loves to play with human flesh. Being a eunuch in the harem was not exactly a privilege. But, curiously, for centuries it was sold as if it were. You will have direct access to the most beautiful women of the empire. You will live in perfumed quarters, receive gifts, have authority. It is very convincing propaganda, until you notice the small anatomical detail written into the contract. It is impressive how human beings manage to turn tragedy into opportunity, and worse, how they manage to make others grateful for it. The Imperial Harem, whether in China, the Middle East, or the Ottoman Empire, was a structure designed to serve a single person, the sovereign. The entire social, political, and emotional architecture revolved around one goal, which might even sound heroic if it were not so painfully banal: to guarantee descendants and pleasure to the most powerful man in the region. It is curious to think that while poets wrote about eternal love and philosophers discussed the nature of the soul, empires were silently orbiting around one man's bed. Romance could stay in the books. The real world always preferred more physiological priorities. And to protect this delicate center of power, the figure of the eunuch was created. Not a soldier, not a priest, not a sage, but a mutilated man. Nothing more effective to ensure that no one with inappropriate intentions would go near the concubines. After all, no one puts a wolf to guard a flock. It is much more practical to turn the wolf into something harmless and then give it the job it never would have been allowed to have before. It is brilliant logic, if you ignore the fact that it depends on someone's suffering. The procedure, of course, varied. Sometimes it was only the removal of certain masculine attributes. In other cases, the full package. Medicine at the time did not help. Rudimentary instruments, no anesthesia, and a mortality rate so high that any modern doctor would faint. But the survivors were rewarded with what historians love to call social mobility. And if that sounds like a joke, it is because it basically was. Some survived the worst, not out of heroism, but because fate has a very dark sense of humor. Inside the palaces, eunuchs moved with a discomforting mixture of invisibility and importance. To the nobles, they were tools. To the concubines, shadows. To princes, useful confidants or easy targets depending on age and mood. To the emperor, however, they were indispensable. Who else could enter every room without raising suspicion? Who else could see, hear, carry secrets and remain officially desexualized, politically harmless, and socially neutral? A eunuch was every dictator's dream, loyal because he had no choice, trustworthy because he had no options, obedient because he had no future. But power has a habit of leaking through the cracks. And precisely because of their proximity to the center of the empire, eunuchs ended up accumulating an influence that, ironically, turned them into a risk that only existed because the system itself placed them in such a strategic position. It is almost funny. The empire creates the eunuch to maintain order, and the eunuch learns to manipulate that order to survive the empire. It is almost poetic, if you ignore the human tragedy behind it. Inside the harem, the atmosphere was as delicate as an expensive vial of poison. The concubines competed with each other in a lethal silence, like poisonous flowers fighting for the gardener's attention. The emperor's mood determined everything: lives, loves, privileges, futures. And the eunuchs were the courier service of this toxic structure. They carried love notes, fabricated gossip, secret orders. All of this without ever being allowed to enjoy the stage where they acted, always watching, always observing, like a bitter critic who knows exactly what makes the audience applaud. And there is an even more cruel detail. Many eunuchs were boys. Some were given away by poor families, others captured, others bought, others just unlucky enough to be born in the wrong place. Childhood, which should be a time of play and discovery, became training in obeying, serving, and keeping quiet. And it is strange, or maybe not, that history has romanticized these roles, as if saying he was the most powerful eunuch at court were a compliment, and not a dark reminder of how entire systems thrived by mutilating bodies and wills. At the height of their influence, some eunuchs did indeed rule from behind the curtains. They manipulated intrigues, organized alliances, influenced entire successions. And for that, of course, they became hated. After all, no one likes to admit that the political machinery of an empire depends on someone whose very existence is a silent critique of the system itself. It is always more convenient to blame the mutilated messenger than the satisfied emperor who commands and controls everyone's life. And how did these men live? You might imagine that at least on the inside, they felt resigned. But historical accounts show something far more complex. Some eunuchs deeply hated their condition. Others embraced it with cold pragmatism. Some nourished quiet resentment. Others found comfort in the power they gained. The truth is that, like all human beings, they learned to survive. And in palaces, where smiles were weapons and tears were weaknesses, surviving was already a kind of victory, even if it cost everything. In the harem, they carried trays, messages, perfumes, secrets, rivalries, and above all, the responsibility of keeping the emperor's little world perfectly functional. They were the invisible hands that adjusted the strings of the theater. And yet they were also the first victims when anything went wrong. That might be the bitterest part of the story. They existed to guard the harem, but did not belong anywhere. They were not men, not nobles, not slaves in the usual sense. They were their own category, carefully engineered to meet a need no one dared to admit out loud. The majestic irony is that the eunuch was both essential and disposable. Like a tool of priceless utility whose value lies in the fact that it can be replaced as long as the replacement is equally mutilated. And for centuries, whole empires functioned perfectly well like this. Perhaps this is the most disturbing detail. It was not an isolated custom or an occasional whim. It was systematic, organized, institutionalized, and accepted. Accepted as part of the natural order. As if the mutilation of thousands of lives were just another bureaucratic item in the administration of power. And the harem, the harem. That golden dream many imagine as a secret paradise, filled with silk, music, and ethereal women. Reality was a bit more narrow. It was a claustrophobic environment where every gesture was calculated, every look analyzed, every smile interpreted. Women trained from early on to please a man who might never be capable of loving them. Women who knew their only weapon was beauty, and their only chance at a better life was to give birth to a son, provided that this son did not displease the random whims of an unpredictable sovereign. The harem was less a paradise and more a chessboard where the pieces were alive, fragile, and disposable. And the eunuch, of course, was the only man allowed to move freely in this world. What a marvelous privilege to walk among forbidden treasures knowing they are as unreachable as the sky. A kind of psychological torture so efficient it hardly needed guards. After all, what kind of rebellion do you expect from someone whose humanity has already been cut out at the root? It is cruel, yes, but power rarely deals in kindness. It prefers efficiency, and nothing is more efficient than turning a whole man into something functional, yet incomplete. And there are still those who say eunuchs were lucky. They received salaries, gifts, fine clothes, they saw the backstage of the empire. Gaining power seemed possible, as long as you ignored the fact that gaining power as a eunuch is like receiving a crown made of rust. It looks impressive from afar, but corrodes everything it touches. In the end, many of these men died alone, with smaller ceremonies, their names erased. Their memories buried under the weight of an official history that rarely cares about those who carry the palace on their shoulders. You might think the tragedy ends here, that at least in death, these men found some kind of peace. Unfortunately, historical cruelty has a remarkable talent for persistence. Eunuchs were often forbidden to have families, to own significant property, or to leave an inheritance. After all, how can you trust someone who cannot perpetuate a bloodline? Society, always so generous, made sure even their last possessions would eventually return to the empire. The state, of course, was grateful. And so, after a lifetime spent serving, spying, obeying, calming, conspiring, or simply surviving, the eunuch disappeared, like smoke, as if he had never existed. The empire moved on. The harem continued. Power traced its eternal arc. The emperor's table remained set, surrounded by women and guarded by new eunuchs, freshly wounded and ready to repeat the same dark story. Nothing changed, because nothing needed to change. The system worked perfectly. As long as you ignored the human ruins it produced. And of course, there will always be those who see beauty in this past, who say it was romantic, exotic, mysterious. Perhaps because it is easier to admire the luxurious architecture of the palace than imagine the pain of those who sustained it. Perhaps because it is more pleasant to fantasize about harems than accept that they were gilded prisons. Perhaps because it is more comfortable to treat eunuchs as curious characters than as victims of a brilliantly cruel system. But history, when observed up close, is rarely beautiful. It is efficient, and sometimes, it is funny, not for the right reasons, but because human absurdity reaches such monumental proportions that there is nothing left but to laugh. A dry, contained laugh, like the ones you hear at funerals when someone says something inappropriately true. Humanity has always had a remarkable talent for turning suffering into systems, pain into hierarchy, mutilation into political structure, and the eunuch is the perfect symbol of all this. He represents the human ability to mold bodies to satisfy ideas, to sacrifice lives, to preserve appearances, to destroy and then demand gratitude for the opportunity given. He is the ideal employee of power, a human being turned into a cog, useful enough to be indispensable, vulnerable enough to be controlled, distorted enough to be forgotten. And so we go on, looking back as if watching a distant fire, horrified, fascinated, and strangely unable to look away. Because, deep down, something in this story attracts us. Something in the tragedy of the eunuchs reveals more about us than we would like to admit. And perhaps that is why we still talk about them. Not because we admire them, but because they are the most uncomfortable reminder that power, when left alone, always finds a creative way to charge its price. And it is almost never cheap. In the end, being a eunuch in the Imperial Harem was more than a curse. It was a cosmic joke, a harsh reminder that the world is not fair, and does not intend to be, that humanity can normalize absolutely anything, as long as it serves the comfort of a few and costs too much to the many. And that, despite all the silk, gold, and music, the most dazzling palaces in the world were built on scars no one wanted to see. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest irony is this: while emperors slept surrounded by luxury, the eunuchs were the only ones who truly knew the heart of the palace. Not because they were free, but because they were trapped exactly where power liked to hide its shame. They were silent witnesses, mutilated guardians of secrets they could never tell. And still, the world kept turning, indifferent to the pain that sustained its history. Because that is what power does. It demands, it consumes, it shapes, and it never apologizes.